So we're going to be making a guide on using REST API with mQuery and Power Query SDK. And I'm going to start off by making a distinction exactly with what is mQuery and Power Query SDK. So mQuery is what you see when you click Advanced Editor on your Power Query editor within Microsoft Excel, Power BI, or Power Query Online. So when you click Advanced Editor, you sort of see this screen with all this code in here. And this is basically your mQuery code. And you can handwrite this if you'd like. So if you have an API that has certain requirements in its documentation, you can sort of code your own mQuery to match those requirements. Maybe you need a request key, maybe you need to generate one, maybe it's static, and so on. Then you have the SDK, and the SDK is basically a more technical person would code in the entire connector, and then a business analyst or someone who uses Power BI can select that connector from the list of available connectors. So in Power BI, when you click Get Data, you sort of see these list of connectors that are available to you. You will have your custom connector available if you build it right. This is available in Power BI and Power Query Online, and it is more so for business analysts who don't have the technical know-how to write their own connectors, or if you are a SaaS company or you are a company that hosts data for certain clients, and you think it might be useful to give your clients a connector where they can pull in your data and they can build dashboards on top of that themselves, then you can also find some use in using the SDK. So we talked about the distinction between mQuery and Power Query SDK and building connectors on top of those two platforms. So what exactly are we going to build? So we're going to be building three different API connectors. You have the unsecured API, you have the secured API, and within secured API, you have static request key and dynamic request key. And I'm just going to walk you through what those two actually mean. So start off with unsecured APIs. Unsecured API is when you want to pull in data and there's no request key involved. So you just pass in the URL and you get the data essentially. So let's consider an example where you have an API that returns a list of boys' names. So you just pass in that URL, but there might be pagination required here. Why? Because in most APIs, they don't give you the entire data in one call. There might be a limit. So consider this scenario where you have this API of a list of boys, and for each call, they'll only allow you to pull in 4 data points. However, the API has about 8 rows of data. So let's see what happens here. When you're paginating, you have page 0 that has the first 4 boys' name, page 1 that has the next 4 boys' name. And what you want to do is you want to take page 0, page 1, or however more pages there may be if there are even more names, and merge them all together as a paginated result. So that's one thing that we're going to do with our unsecured call. The second thing we're going to do is navigation table. So consider an example where you have an API and the API has multiple endpoints. So we talked about one example where the API will have a list of boys' names. Let's say the same base URL has another endpoint where it has a list of girls' names. So how do we do that? So we can build a navigation table using the SDK, and it'll essentially work in a way where you're in Power BI, you select the connector that you want to use, and you put in your link, and essentially you'll have the two options to choose from. So that's what we're going to do and we're going to build on top of. Our next thing is secured API with a static request key. So what does that mean? There might be some API providers that give you a request key that stays valid for indefinitely unless you want to refresh it. So you would just have to pass on that request key onto your headers, and in that sense, we'll be able to pull in data. So here's an example of we're using the connector that we just built, but we're putting in the hyperlink as well as another field called the request key. And if the request key is correct, in that scenario, we will get the boys and girls table. Finally, the dynamic request key, which is the most common way of doing it, where you have a request key, but it expires after a certain period. The only way to get this request key is you do an authorization call, And when you're doing this authorization call, you're putting in like multiple parameters. So in our example, we would need to put in the Office ID and App ID. And if those two match, only then will it generate the request key. And once you get the request key will be put into the boys endpoint and the girls endpoint, and the two tables will be generated. So here's a quick example where we have the connector, we open it up on Power Query, and it asks us for the two different IDs, the Office ID and the App ID. Once you pull that in and it matches, we get both the boys and the girls table. So with that out of the way, we're going to start building these different connectors.